Here, this is 2022, Set 2, AP Macro, obviously. Number 3. The country's Zeta is in long-run equilibrium. However, the government is concerned about the size of the national debt. Okay. Identify one specific policy action the government can take to reduce the national debt. So, we should recognize that to reduce the national debt, there's a couple things that the government can always do. Fiscal policy is always the government either doing government spending or taxes. If we want a contractionary policy to reduce that debt so that the government doesn't owe as much, they can either reduce government spending or they can increase taxes. Either one of these is going to reduce the amount of money that the government has to borrow. So if they spend less, they don't have to borrow as much. That'll reduce the debt. And if they tax more, that's obviously going to reduce the debt also, because that means they're not borrowing as much money. So let's look at B. Easy enough there. That's just fiscal policy, contractionary fiscal policy. That's pretty simple. All right, draw a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market and show the effect of the fiscal policy action on real interest rate. This is pretty standard here. All right, real interest rates on the vertical. They're giving you that. They're telling you what's on the vertical. The real interest rate, quantity of loanable funds, supply of loanable funds, demand for loanable funds. Now, I'm going to draw two of these. They're not asking us to be specific here. They're not saying what happens to supply of loanable funds or demand for loanable funds. They just are saying draw a loanable funds graph, correctly labeled, and then show what happens when the government spends less. So, if the government is spending less, that means, and remember, loanable funds, the way we think about it, is it's just the money in the banks. That's all it is, money in the banks. It's showing that stock of money in the banks, and if the government is spending less, they have to be taking less out of the banks. So if we're thinking supply of loanable funds, we're going to think that there must be more supply in the banks. The government isn't taking it out, so there has to be more supply left in the banks. So supply shifts to the right. Real interest rate falls. IR1, IR2. You do want to show all axes, label all axes correctly. Let's just call that Q1 and Q2. Now, they could have specifically asked you to say what happens to the supply of loanable funds, and you would have done this. Or they could have said what happens to demand for loanable funds. Now, I tend to be a supply of loanable funds guy, and that's the first thing I always think about. But if they had said specifically, Charles, what about demand for loanable funds? Well, I know what's happening to the real interest rate. It's going down. So I really just need to shift my demand for loanable funds to show that real interest rate going down, because I know that's happening. Now, a more sort of, if you had to explain it, obviously, if the government is spending less money, they're taking less money out of the banks. The demand for the money in the banks or the loanable funds is decreasing. So in some ways, the demand for loanable funds shifting left here makes more sense to me than the supply of loanable funds increasing. This is kind of, I tend to know it one way, and then if they ask you specifically, you do it other way. Either one of these graphs is absolutely correct. They would have taken either one, so you figure out which one makes most sense to you, and then you do that and practice it so you know exactly what's going on. Easy. All right, C. Based on the change in the real interest rate, what will happen to each of the following? Aggregate demand in the short run, or potential real output. Well, if real interest rates are going down, we should know that real interest rates affect investment. And when we're talking about investment, we're thinking of people taking out loans in the loanable funds market, right? So if that real interest rate goes down, more people are going to take out loans, right, as that investment, and they're going to build capital goods. Let's just think about that, right? So there's more investment going on. We know if there's more investment, there's got to be more aggregate demand. And this is what they're looking for your explanation right here, right? That you recognize this causal chain of thinking. Real interest rate goes down, investment goes up, aggregate demand goes up. Easy enough. This one's a little more complicated, but not much more. It's pretty simple. You just have to know that the College Board's being tricky here. Potential real output is the same thing as if they said, what's happening to your PPC? What's happening to your long run aggregate supply? What's happening to economic growth? These are all the same thing, right? So we just have to recognize how to answer this question. What will happen each year? So real output's going to increase, right? We know real output is going to go up, right? In the long run, because there's more capital goods, they want us to explain it. So that's how I would have explained this. I would have said real interest rates go down, investment goes up. When there's more investment, you can just assume there's got to be more production of capital goods. The way they always say it is capital formation. So we could have said capital formation. That's how I would have answered it, because I like to answer it the way they always do. Real interest rate goes down, investment goes up, capital formation increases, therefore potential real output increases. I could have also said my PPC shifts out, right? I could have shown that with an outward shift of the PPC. That would be economic growth. I could have recognized that my long run aggregate supply curve must have shifted to the right. So I'd make sure I know how to do that. And just know that that implies economic growth has increased. Pretty easy on this third one. All right, guys, be safe, take care, and I'm on Wyzant, Charles Wall, if you're looking for help. Keep working hard, be safe.